Okay, so thank you very much for the invite to present here. I presented actually in the first MEED in 2018, so it's lovely to be back. The context for this work I'm going to present was a PhD undertaken with funding from the Glasgow Molecular Pathology Node, and it concerned how early methods of HTA can help the developers of diagnostics, so very much focused on simple methodology and focusing on the kind of clinical utility of a test before we even get to the economic evaluation of it. There was a focus in my PhD on diagnostics, and this work I'm going to present was repurposed by myself and Neil Hawkins, who's also at the University of Glasgow with me, Professor Neil Hawkins, and we noted during one of my case studies just the importance of thinking about whether or not existing test capacity, so your reference test that we use to kind of describe the equivalent of the PCR test, the one that's considered gold standard, if you like, the impact of whether or not that's constrained. So we repurposed this from one of the case studies in my PhD. So it's not an original piece of work related to COVID, but the case study that we use is drawn from COVID. So this is a schematic that I've used a lot in my PhD and drawn on it a lot. I find it really useful just to pull together kind of how the product technology, health technology development, we've got here basic research coming through to prototype product development, how that fits in with the usefulness of early HTA and feeding in then to later HTA. I'm not really going to talk today about the differences between early HTA and mainstream HTA, but we generally just we're interested in simpler models at this stage, a lot simpler than Simon's been talking about, and talking about, well, if it had certain characteristics, could it deliver? I'm sure most people listening to this will be aware that this kind of three-stage clinical evidence gathering exercise that's demonstrated here with the three-phase clinical trials is not typical for diagnostics. So this represents more the pharmaceutical development pathway with market access at the end of the three phases of clinical trials. Diagnostics tend to come to market earlier once they've established safety and analytical validity. And as a result, clinical utility evidence is very often lacking. And this is complicated by two related issues. So the first issue is that the setting that the diagnostic is going to be used in is extremely important for the clinical utility, and also that tests can be used at different points in clinical pathways, diagnostic pathways. So this graphic just illustrates the different ways tests can be used. So if you think about a GP sending a patient for an X-ray, that might be replaced by a new test. So rather than sending them for an X-ray, you send them for an MRI. You could also put a new test into an add-on position. So the GP sends for the X-ray, but they also get an MRI. And then what we're looking at today is using a test in a triage strategy so that your decision to send for the X-ray is actually determined by a new test. And there's many situations where this kind of scenario is useful. So here's a few examples of when triage tests might be useful. Using this D-dimer blood test as an example in pulmonary embolism. So D-dimer can be used. It's a quick and cheap blood test. And the reference test there is CT scan. So that's capacity constrained, quite expensive, and needs specialist personnel. TB has difficult samples, and you also need lab facilities and time to culture the sample. So there, a triage test might be very useful to cut down the time that was required or to deal with those difficult samples. And then finally, as an example of where a triage test might be useful, one of the other case studies from my PhD was looking at the use of a blood test between PSA test, which many of you will know has a very high false positives rate in prostate cancer. And in Hong Kong, where this study was based, you went straight from a PSA test to a biopsy, and then biopsy is expensive, has some nasty side effects, which are also expensive to treat. So slotting in in this case, it was a Beckman-Coulter PHI test, so one that was already on the market, but slotting that into the diagnostic pathway avoided many biopsies, so avoided a lot of unpleasant side effects, and also was highly cost effective. So all those kind of situations where reference tests are problematic. So I want to move on to talk about just the importance of test characteristics and the difference between rule in and rule out. Rule in and rule out. Sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of my pointer so that I can click on this. And this is a really great app that I found during my PhD work that I don't know about anybody else, but I find diagnostic, the various wrangling of all the different statistics in diagnostics very difficult, and I often come back to this kind of idea just to firm up thinking. And where it's helpful here is you can see the I wonder if that's
hi there, Janet, sorry to jump in. Could you share your screen just so we can see the app that you're showing off?
Right, you can't see that. Okay, I'll stop.
Just got your slides.
I'll stop and reshare. Okay. Is that
Brilliant.
better?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the thing I come back to when I'm struggling to understand something in diagnostics. And so looking at here, this will be a graphic that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. The red is people who are disease positive, the blue is people who are disease negative, and we set the threshold for our test and as we move the threshold for our test, it moves our sensitivity and specificity. So let's have a look at a threshold of about 40. And what you can see here is that we've got a very highly sensitive test there. So this is what we call a rule out test. It's got very high negative predictive value. If the test says you're negative, you're, let's have a look what negative, you're 99.23% likely to be negative. There's just this tiny kind of tail of false negatives. And this is an important kind of test when the consequences of a missed case are very serious. So, for example, the threshold in the D-dimer tests and the PHI tests in prostate cancer would be set so that we had very few false negatives. And it means that these people can be safely de-escalated, if you like. Then if we increase the threshold up to about 65, you can see that that creates a high specificity test, and so known as a rule-in test. And here the opposite is true. You've got very high positive predictive value. And that can be very useful, and we'll see how that is useful in triage testing when you've got constrained capacity. So we're interested in the enrichment of the positive population, the fact that there's a lot more positive cases in the triage positive test population. So I'm trying to go back now to, has that worked, Sean? Am I back on the
So I think if you do what you did last time, if you stop sharing and then share your slides again.
Stop share again. It's funny because it shows it on.
It was fine before, wasn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, who knows?
Here we go.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so can you see my screen? Oh, it's now not wanting to
yeah, so we've got your slides.
Got my slide. Ah, right, okay. So that was my belt and braces slide in case it didn't work at all. So moving on now to the case study. So we've got a simple decision tree here in where the reference test is unconstrained, and we're comparing a no triage strategy, so going straight to reference test, with a triage strategy where only people who are positive get the reference test. So we can see that everybody gets the reference test in the no triage strategy. But in the triage strategy, we save some money on reference tests because we don't test anybody who's negative, but we do have the downside of missing some cases. So very familiar kind of trade-off there in the economic evaluation would be how you value your missed cases and you're saving money on the reference tests. When the reference test is constrained, that makes a little bit of a difference. In the no triage strategy, you'll see that we've also got people who can't get the reference test. So we're missing cases even under the no triage strategy. In the triage strategy, anybody that tests positive, this results in an enriched population. And so we're actually diagnosing a greater number of cases. We've still got missed cases, but I'm indicating here that missed cases becomes a little bit of a red herring, because actually under this strategy, under the triage strategy, we're diagnosing more cases than we would under the no triage strategy. So the metrics change when the test is constrained. So the test that we ran the numbers on was, we just picked one from the FIND website. I think there were about 600 to choose from when we did this work. And we picked a test with high specificity, but relatively low, well, very low sensitivity, the Corris bioconcept test. And we couldn't find a suitable rule-out test, so we just flipped those. And these are the metrics, the clinical performance where capacity is unconstrained. So these would be the ones we're familiar with looking at. So we've got under the reference test only strategy, reference test only strategy compared to the rule-in strategy and the rule-out strategy. So high specificity, high sensitivity. You can see that the rule-in test allows us to avoid a huge proportion of the reference testing. So 94% of the reference testing with the savings that would deliver. Even the rule-out test allows us to avoid quite a high percentage, nearly 50%. But the trade-off is the probability of a missed case, and we're assuming here that the reference test has 100% accuracy. And our trade-off here is that because of the low sensitivity, we're missing quite a lot of cases here. We assumed a 5% prevalence in this case study, whereas here we're not missing so many cases because of our high sensitivity. This is the clinical performance where capacity is constrained, and the main point to note here is that the relevance of the metrics that we were looking at previously has been replaced. So we've got new metrics here. So we're interested in how many more people can we test. So we can actually test with the rule-in test. We can test 16 times more people. The relative expansion of reference test coverage, the difference between these two numbers. So this is how many people will we find, how many more cases will we find. So we'll find 8 times more cases with this specificity than using a reference test only strategy. And so if you are tested with the reference test, we're likely to find 34.1% more cases than we would with just using reference tests when we'd be at 5% because of prevalence. The performance of the rule-out test is a lot lower. We get a lot lower expansion of the population, and that's because we've got a high number of false positives. So we're using up the reference test capacity quite quickly, but we still do get an incremental probability of a positive reference test. So looking at some sensitivities, we've got here prevalence along the bottom and probability up the y-axis. This is our 5% prevalence in our base case. So you'd see we were at about 34% incremental cases. So the solid line is when we're in the constrained case, what's the incremental probability of detection with triage? You can see that right along the loop of prevalence, we're delivering more positive cases than we would with a reference test strategy. The dashed line is in the unconstrained case, what's the proportionate reduction in reference test use with triage? So you can see with the rule-in test, we're delivering very high reductions in reference test use. And then this is the false negative rate. Similarly, for the rule-out test with the high sensitivity, the same metrics. So the solid line is the incremental probability of detection. You see that, so we were at, I think it was about 4% at 5% prevalence. So you're still delivering more cases, even with the lower specificity. And you've got also lower proportionate reduction in reference test use, because we saw that started at about, in our base case, it was about near just under 50%, and that's reducing as prevalence increases. And the false negative rate. These two, this sensitivity just shows for all levels of specificity and sensitivity what relative expansion we can get. So how many more cases we're delivering. And you can see that here's our rule-in test, much more important what your specificity is to get that expansion in coverage. Even with high sensitivity, you're not getting a huge expansion. And then this is in the unconstrained case, what proportionate reduction you're getting in reference testing. And again, you can see that the rule-in test with high specificity is delivering a greater reduction in reference testing. But of course, that would be balanced with your missed cases in an unconstrained case. So I hope that's not totally confused everybody. The main points are where a test is used in a triage position, lower accuracy tests can still be useful. And when there's limited capacity of the high accuracy or the reference test, triage testing strategies can increase the population covered and the number of cases identified. And when the capacity of the high accuracy diagnostic test is not limited, then we're looking at a more traditional balancing between reduction in the number of tests required at the cost of missed cases.